History is full of great rulers. This video is not about them. This is about the people who got a crown, a throne, an army, and still managed to act like the least qualified person in the room. We are talking about emperors who fought the sea, kings who treated government like a joke, and leaders who made entire nations suffer through their spectacular stupidity. Here are 33 idiots that ruled nations. 1. Peter. The Third of Russia had the kind of brain that makes you double-check whether destiny was drunk. Before he even became emperor, he treated his toy soldiers like an actual military command. So when a rat chewed the heads off a couple of them, Peter did not shrug and move on like a normal human. He staged a miniature court-martial, found the rat guilty under military law, and had it hanged as a warning. That alone tells you everything. Russia in the mid-18th century needed a serious ruler who could handle war, court factions, and diplomacy. Instead, it got a man emotionally invested in starch soldiers and rodent justice. His reign lasted only months before he was overthrown, which honestly feels like the most rational thing anyone around him ever did. 2. Caligula is what happens when absolute power meets the personality of a sleep-deprived theater kid who has never once been told no. In 40 CE, he marched troops to the northern coast of Gaul, supposedly preparing to invade Britain. Then the whole operation swerved into pure historical parody. Ancient accounts say he had the soldiers collect seashells as the spoils of the conquered ocean. And later tradition turned that into the famous story of him basically declaring war on Neptune. Imagine being a hardened Roman legionary, trained for conquest, standing there in armor while your emperor orders you to fight the beach and come home with shell trophies like an angry child after a failed vacation. Rome ruled half the known world, and for a moment its military machine looked like a very expensive daycare field trip. 3. Christian VII of Denmark was king, at least on paper. But the real tragedy is that an entire state had to function around a monarch whose court behavior sounded like a prank show with chandeliers. He suffered from severe mental illness, and his incapacity opened the door for courtiers, advisors, and power brokers to effectively run the kingdom around him. But what made him infamous was how absurdly childlike and cruel his public behavior could become. Contemporary stories and later accounts describe him slapping people for amusement, acting out during serious meetings, and turning royal decorum into something closer to a badly supervised nursery. Denmark in the late 18th century was dealing with reform, foreign pressures, and internal power struggles. Meanwhile, the king was reportedly leapfrogging over dignitaries. It is hard to project majesty when your ruler behaves like the human version of a loose firework. 4. King Farouk of Egypt managed the rare achievement of being both fabulously rich and allegedly unable to stop stealing other people's stuff. That is not greed anymore. That is elite-level broken wiring. Farouk inherited the throne young, lived in cartoonish luxury, and became notorious for indulgence, excess, and a talent for making monarchy look like a family business run by casino addicts. He was widely mocked for kleptomania, to the point that stories about him pinching valuables from official guests became part of his legend. The most famous tale says he even stole Winston Churchill's pocket watch. Whether every version of that story is perfectly clean or not, the larger point absolutely is. Farouk became internationally known as a king who could not resist swiping trinkets at formal events. When your royal image starts drifting toward pickpocket with a palace, the revolution is basically warming up in the parking lot. 5. Ferdinand I of Austria was emperor during a period when Europe was boiling with revolution, nationalism, and political crisis. This was not a great time for the man in charge to feel like a confused extra in his own government. Ferdinand had serious neurological and developmental problems, and real power mostly sat in the hands of advisors around him. But history remembers him less for statecraft than for one gloriously ridiculous outburst about food. When told he could not have apricot dumplings because apricots were out of season, he reportedly exploded with, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." And honestly, that sentence deserves its own marble plaque. The Habsburg monarchy was facing the modern age, and its emperor's best-known contribution to political thought was essentially, "Seasonal produce is tyranny." Somewhere beneath the comedy is a sad truth, but the line still lands like imperial baby rage. 6. Qin Shi Huang unified China, standardized weights and writing, built colossal state machinery, and then ruined the final act by falling for the ancient version of wellness fraud. This man conquered rival kingdoms and laid foundations for imperial China. But he also became obsessed with immortality. Not just interested, obsessed. He sent expeditions searching for magical islands, consulted alchemists, and swallowed elixirs that were supposed to keep him alive forever. The problem was that many of those miracle concoctions contained mercury. So the first emperor of a unified China, a man terrified of death and desperate to outsmart nature, likely helped poison himself in pursuit of eternal life. It is one of history's greatest self-owns. He wanted to become death-proof and instead turned himself into a cautionary tale about trusting mystical supplement culture. Ancient empire, modern lesson. If someone promises you immortality in pill form, maybe do not start with the heavy metals. 7. James II of England hit crisis mode during the Glorious Revolution and handled it with the calm, strategic brilliance of a man panic-flushing state legitimacy down a river. As William of Orange advanced and James's support collapsed, the king lost his nerve, sent his family away, and fled. But he also threw the Great Seal of the realm into the Thames, apparently imagining that without this symbol of royal authority, the new regime would somehow be unable to function. That is a spectacularly medieval level of magical thinking. It is like assuming a modern government would collapse because someone stole the office stamp. England was undergoing one of the most important constitutional turning points in its history, with the balance of power shifting permanently away from absolute monarchy. And James responded like a guy hiding the TV remote so nobody else can be the dad now. 8. Francois Duvalier of Haiti was not funny in the normal sense because his regime was brutal, paranoid, and soaked in terror. So the joke here is entirely on him, not on the people who suffered under him. Duvalier built a dictatorship around fear, personality cult, and calculated use of voodoo symbolism. He wanted to seem mystical, untouchable, almost supernatural. And in that atmosphere of paranoia came one of the most infamous stories about his rule. The belief that a political enemy had transformed into a black dog, leading to a crackdown on black dogs in Port-au-Prince. Even if details vary in retellings, the wider reality is solid. Duvalier weaponized superstition and fear while ruling through violence and the Tonton Macoute. When a ruler starts mixing state power, occult theater, and dog-level political paranoia, the country is no longer being governed. It is being held hostage by someone's nightmare. 9. Charles VI of France became known as Charles the Mad, and medieval France paid the bill for that title in civil chaos. His mental breakdowns were severe, recurring, and politically disastrous. At one point, he reportedly believed his body was made of glass, which sounds like satire written by a very mean playwright, but no, this is a real historical delusion. He feared he might shatter if touched, wore reinforced clothing, and tried to keep people away from him. That would already be strange in a village, but this was the King of France during the 100 Years' War, exactly the moment when stability mattered. Instead, the crown drifted into factional struggle between Burgundians and Armagnacs, while the English took advantage. So yes, France once had a monarch trying not to crack like a decorative vase, while the kingdom itself was doing exactly that. Symbolism this aggressive should be illegal. 10. Edward II of England had all the tools to be a powerful medieval king, and somehow gave off the energy of a man who really just wanted to be left alone with a shovel. Chroniclers mocked him for preferring what they called rustic pursuits, digging ditches, thatching roofs, doing manual tasks that looked very strange coming from a crowned monarch. Now, to be fair, a king enjoying practical work is not automatically idiotic. But Edward paired those odd hobbies with catastrophic political judgment, favoritism, noble resentment, military failure, and one of the most humiliating reigns in English history. So the ditch digging became less refreshingly humble, and more, why is the kingdom on fire while His Majesty is role-playing as a laborer? He had the barons furious, Scotland emboldened, and the monarchy weakened. England did not need a king auditioning for Village Handyman of the Month. It needed someone who could actually rule. 11. Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya for decades and managed to make every foreign trip feel like a traveling hallucination. He cultivated the image of a desert revolutionary to almost cartoon levels, insisting on Bedouin symbolism even when visiting world capitals. So yes, he became famous for hauling around his tent and demanding the comforts of nomadic identity in places like Rome, Paris, and New York, because apparently the diplomatic protocol manual did not have a chapter called What to Do When the Colonel Wants to Camp in Your City. Accounts from biographers and contemporary reports also note his fixation on fresh camel milk, which is already eccentric until you imagine the logistics team trying to make that happen internationally. Libya, meanwhile, was not some quirky personal art project. It was a state. But Gaddafi often governed like the entire world was just a stage set for his ego, costumes, and portable desert cosplay. 12. Empress Dowager Cixi faced a world where Qing China desperately needed serious military modernization, especially after humiliations by foreign powers. So naturally, one of the most infamous symbols tied to her name is a giant marble boat. Nothing says ready for naval war like a ship that cannot move, cannot float, and mostly exists to sit there being decorative while the empire gets bullied by actual gunboats. Historians still debate the exact accounting and symbolism, but the broader reality is clear enough. Funds meant for strengthening China's navy were diverted amid corruption and court extravagance, and the marble boat at the Summer Palace became the perfect monument to elite delusion. The empire needed steel, strategy, and reform. Instead, it got luxury landscaping with nautical branding. If your answer to military weakness is, what if we built a warship for the garden? Maybe history is going to roast you forever. And in this case, it absolutely did. 13. Elagabalus was a teenage Roman emperor whose reign is wrapped in scandal, exaggeration, and hostile ancient gossip, which is saying a lot because Rome already had a very high baseline for nonsense. Even with that warning label attached, the stories are glorious. Late ancient sources say he pulled banquet pranks that sound like a psycho-class clown with imperial funding, including what later writers treat as an early whoopee cushion gag. They also describe him unleashing tame big cats among guests after heavy feasts, just to watch them panic. Now, historians rightly warn that the Historia Augusta is not exactly the gold standard of sober truth. It is more like ancient clickbait with sandals. But the consistent picture is that Elagabalus was remembered as wildly eccentric, theatrical, and disastrous. Rome expected an emperor. Instead, it got a shock content gremlin with lions. 14. Philip V of Spain was not just melancholy. He was the kind of melancholy that drags an empire into your sleep schedule problems. Severe mental illness shaped much of his later life, and reports about his behavior grew stranger over time. He became deeply withdrawn, increasingly nocturnal, and capable of turning the royal court into a bizarre after-hours operation, because his personal rhythm no longer resembled normal human civilization. Some later retellings add the colorful claim that he feared sunlight would somehow darken him, which may be more legend than clean archival fact. But the core madness is real enough. The King of Spain often slept by day, functioned at night, and forced the machinery of monarchy to orbit his disorder. Imagine ministers, officials, and courtiers adjusting to what felt less like government and more like being trapped inside an imperial insomnia episode. When the state starts running on vampire office hours, something has gone extremely, majestically wrong. 15. Yahya Jammeh of Gambia is what happens when dictatorship and infomercial delusion decide to become roommates. In 2007, he publicly claimed he could cure HIV and AIDS with his secret herbal treatment, and he also bragged about treating asthma. Not in some vague spiritual healer way either. This was presented with the confidence of a man who thought science was an annoying rumor. Reports described bizarre scheduling rules for his supposed miracle cures, with certain days reserved for certain illnesses, plus bananas, herbal brews, and presidential theater instead of medicine. That is already grotesque because real people were desperate and vulnerable. And that is the key point. The stupidity here was not harmless weirdness. It was lethal vanity dressed up as healing. A head of state should not sound like a roadside wizard who only works Mondays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. That is not public health. That is national embarrassment with side effects. 16. Adolf Fredrik of Sweden is remembered by generations of schoolchildren as the king who basically ate himself to death, which is the most humiliating royal epitaph since lost a war against a puddle. On Shrove Tuesday in 1771, he sat down to an enormous meal, and later accounts say he finished it with an absurd amount of semla, those cream-filled buns served in hot milk. 14 portions is the number usually attached to the story, because apparently one dessert said joy, 2 said indulgence, and 14 said, please summon the undertaker. To be fair, modern historians note that the exact menu got embellished over time, and the immediate cause was more complicated than cartoon gluttony. But the tradition is old and persistent for a reason. He died after overindulging massively. Sweden once had a king whose final boss battle was dessert, and the dessert won clean. 17. Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire is remembered with the nickname the Mad, which is one of those historical labels that leaves very little room for mystery. He spent years confined in the cafes, the palace system used to isolate potential rivals, and by the time he reached the throne, he was unstable, paranoid, and catastrophically unfit for power. Stories from his court and later chroniclers paint a ruler drifting in self-indulgence and whim, with tales of him tossing coins to fish in palace pools like some unwell aquatic philanthropist. Other stories about his cruelty and bizarre amusements grew around his reign as well, though the most lurid ones need caution. What does not need caution is the political result: misrule, factional manipulation, and imperial weakness. The Ottoman state needed disciplined leadership. Instead, it got a sultan who seemed one bad impulse away from trying to appoint a sturgeon as Grand Vizier. 18. Richard the Lionheart is celebrated as a warrior king, which is great if your definition of good king is expensive foreign action hero. He ruled England for almost 10 years and spent only a tiny fraction of that time there. He barely spoke English, cared more about his continental lands and crusading glory than about the actual kingdom he wore on his head, and treated England mainly as a cash machine for his wars. The line attributed to him, that he would have sold London if he could find a buyer, is almost too perfect. And even if you allow for rhetorical flourish, it captures the truth beautifully. Richard was brave, yes, spectacularly brave. But England did not exactly get attentive domestic management. It got a landlord who never comes by, raises the rent, and insists he is too busy being legendary elsewhere. Wonderful for ballads, less impressive if you actually lived under the taxes. 19. The Zhengde Emperor of Ming China had the kind of imagination that would be charming in a bored teenager and mildly alarming in literally anyone else. In an emperor, it was a bureaucratic hostage situation. He grew famous for bizarre role-playing, especially the story that he had a fake market built inside or near the palace grounds so he could wander through it pretending to be an ordinary guy. Ministers, eunuchs, and attendants had to dress as merchants and commoners while His Majesty played discount realism in a controlled environment. Imagine running one of the world's largest empires and being forced to staff your boss's pretend street fair because he wants to cosplay as a shopper. And Zhengde was not merely eccentric and private. His reign became associated with erratic behavior, contempt for protocol, and official frustration. The Emperor of China had unlimited access to the real world, and still chose Palace Disneyland. That is commitment to missing the point. 20. King Otto of Bavaria spent most of his reign mentally incapacitated and out of public life, so the cruel absurdity here lies in the stories that grew around his confinement. One particularly grim anecdote, repeated in old newspaper accounts, says he demanded a peasant be shot for his amusement each morning. His attendants, allegedly trying to satisfy him without actually murdering anyone, loaded the gun with harmless ammunition while a man dressed as a peasant performed a dramatic death outside. Now, this story belongs firmly in the zone of anecdotal late reporting, so take it with the caution you would normally reserve for royal gossip passed through a megaphone. But even as a rumor, it tells you how Otto's condition was perceived. Not merely tragic, but surreal and detached from reality. Bavaria effectively had a kingdom ruled in name by a man for whom staff had to stage fake executions like some nightmare breakfast theater. 21. Idi Amin did not simply rule Uganda. He performed rulership like a man trying to win a contest for most absurd dictator, while also being genuinely terrifying. He awarded himself titles that sounded as if a satire writer had been denied sleep for 3 days, including Conqueror of the British Empire. And he leaned into the bizarre public persona so hard that he also styled himself as the uncrowned King of Scotland. This would be funny if it were not attached to a regime of murder, torture, and mass fear. That contrast is what makes Amin so grotesque. He could move from bragging, boxing, and theatrical bombast to atrocities without blinking. In later years, his behavior became more erratic and grandiose, like a man who mistook delusion for statecraft. Uganda deserved institutions. Instead, it got a violent narcissist cosplaying as a world historical legend in his own head, and demanding the country join the bit. 22. Qin Er Shi, the second emperor of Qin, inherited one of the most powerful states in the ancient world and managed to become the perfect puppet for one of history's creepiest political loyalty tests. His minister, Zhao Gao, famously brought a deer to court and called it a horse. The emperor laughed, because obviously it was a deer, but then officials were forced to choose, tell the truth or echo the lie. Those who insisted on reality paid dearly. That moment became so iconic that Chinese still use the phrase calling a deer a horse for blatant distortion. And honestly, it deserves immortality. Imagine ruling an empire so badly that your court becomes a live-action experiment in whether facts still exist. Qin Er Shi was weak, manipulable, and overwhelmed while rebellion spread and the Qin dynasty rapidly collapsed. The empire did not die only because of one deer, obviously, but wow, did the deer reveal the problem. 23. James I of England had enough anxiety to open a chain of medieval panic rooms. He was deeply afraid of assassination and reportedly wore heavily padded clothes as protection against knives, to the point that later observers described him as bulky and awkward in motion. In a period when kings were supposed to project effortless majesty, James sometimes came off like a nervous cushion with a crown. Add to that the long-running gossip about his hygiene. Later writers loved claiming he almost never bathed and feared water would make him ill, though modern historians warn that some of those stories were exaggerated by hostile tradition. Still, even stripping away the nastier myths, the broad image remains. James was fussy, fearful, physically odd in presentation, and obsessed with safety. England got a king who defended divine monarchy while dressing like he expected a cutlery uprising at any moment. Royal dignity was having a difficult day. 24. Francisco Matías Nguema turned Equatorial Guinea into one of the most deranged dictatorships of the 20th century, and he did it with the insecure fury of a man who hated competence on sight. This was not mere corruption. It was scorched earth anti-reality. He banned the use of the word intellectual, treated educated people as threats, and dismantled institutions with the efficiency of a termite colony in a library. Reports about his rule also describe him hoarding the state's money in wildly informal ways while the country collapsed around him. By the end, professionals fled, infrastructure rotted, and government function was basically replaced by terror and superstition. The detail about suitcases of cash under the bed survives because it perfectly matches the regime's vibe. A national treasury run like a paranoid uncle hiding envelopes in a mattress. When you execute expertise, ban intelligence, and personalize the budget, you are not governing a country, you are vandalizing one. 25. Louis XVI inherited France at a moment when reform was difficult, finances were bad, and the social order was basically a chandelier hanging by dental floss. What did this king bring to the emergency? Locks. Specifically, a hobbyist passion for lockmaking, masonry, and private tinkering that would be weirdly wholesome if it were not happening while the Bourbon monarchy drifted toward catastrophe. Britannica puts it plainly. He kept diverting himself with hunting, locks, and hobbies while lacking the political insight and decisiveness needed for the crisis. That is the killer detail. Louis was not some cackling supervillain. He was worse for the job in a different way, passive, hesitant, and terminally unbuilt for the moment. France was moving toward revolution, and its king was in the workshop fiddling with mechanisms while society itself was coming apart. History really looked at him and said, "Wonderful with keys, tragic with kingdoms." 26. Murad. The fourth of the Ottoman Empire looked at coffee houses and decided the correct policy response was, apparently, homicide. He banned coffee, tobacco, and alcohol with extreme severity, treating coffee houses as nests of sedition and disorder. Which, to be fair, they sometimes were politically lively places. But Murad's answer was not regulation, persuasion, or boring administrative stuff. It was terror. Contemporary and later accounts say he prowled the streets in disguise to catch violators personally, with drinkers and smokers facing execution. Just imagine the scene. You are trying to enjoy a cup of coffee, maybe complain about taxes, maybe mind your business, and suddenly the ruler of the empire is doing undercover caffeine enforcement with murder as customer feedback. Ottoman political history is full of drama, but Murad turned beverage policy into a slasher film. If your national anti-coffee campaign requires decapitation, perhaps the coffee was not the main problem. 27. George III is remembered partly through the fog of illness, myth, and later cultural retelling. But some stories from his periods of mental breakdown are so bizarre they sound invented by a novelist trying too hard. One of the most famous says he mistook a tree for the King of Prussia and began conversing with it as though conducting diplomacy. Even if you hear that and immediately think, surely not, the story stuck for a reason. George's episodes of mania were public, alarming, and politically destabilizing. He talked incessantly, behaved erratically, and forced the court and parliament to confront the nightmare of a monarch who could not reliably be monarching. The tragedy is real, but the absurdity is impossible to ignore. Britain, the self-proclaimed model of state seriousness, once had a king trying foreign policy on an oak tree. Somewhere the tree probably gave better answers than half the cabinet. 28. Maximilian I of Mexico arrived as a European import wrapped in imperial fantasy at exactly the wrong moment. Mexico was in the middle of civil conflict, foreign intervention, and a gigantic legitimacy crisis, and this Habsburg Archduke thought one solution was to obsess over court ceremony. Not just polite manners, but full imperial choreography. Maximilian and Carlota paid close attention to etiquette and ceremonial, and his regime produced elaborate regulations for the court, the palace, and every possible ribbon and stocking detail that could make a fragile imported monarchy feel respectable. It is almost admirable in its commitment to the wrong priority. The empire was bleeding, Republicans were fighting, and French support was wobbling. But sure, let us spend precious energy deciding how the household should perform aristocratic dignity. It is hard to overstate the mismatch. The country was on a battlefield, and Maximilian was writing dress code fan fiction for a throne that was already disappearing underneath him. 29. Ethelred the Unready has one of history's meanest nicknames, and the brutal part is that he earned it in the most expensive way possible. Faced with Viking attacks, his signature move became paying them off with vast sums of money, the famous Danegeld. Now, buying peace is not always stupid in itself. Sometimes it is the least awful option available. But under Ethelred, it became a pattern so glaring that it practically advertised England as a reusable ATM for Scandinavian war bands. The Danes took the money, paused, then came back, because of course they did. Why would they stop? Your defense policy literally told them raiding works. Britannica calls him an ineffectual ruler, and that feels polite. This was the medieval version of handing your bully lunch money every week, and being shocked he still knows where you sit. At some point, even the Vikings had to admire the business model. 30. This one gets mangled online, so here is the cleaner version. The famous Chinese story about a ruler elevating a cook because of culinary genius belongs not to Emperor Xuanzong, but to the much older legend of Yi Yin, who rose to high office under Tang, founder of the Shang dynasty. Why does that matter? Because it shows how history internet loves to take a weird anecdote, throw it in a blender, and serve it as emperor soup. Still, the underlying image is too good to ignore. The idea that brilliant cooking opened the door to top political power because the man understood balance, flavor, and order so well he could be trusted with the state. It is gloriously Chinese in metaphor and wildly dangerous in literal reading. Running a kitchen and running an empire are not exactly the same thing, though some rulers clearly wished cabinet selection were a food festival. Either way, it remains one of history's strangest recruitment fantasies. 31. King John of England was already a disaster before the swamp decided to humiliate him personally. In 1216, during the chaos of the First Barons' War, John's baggage train was supposedly caught in the tidal flats and marshes of the Wash. According to the traditional story, the king's treasure, plate, and maybe even crown jewels vanished into the mud and water forever. Historians still argue over exactly what was lost and how much of the legend grew later, but the core image has never stopped being funny. One of England's least loved kings somehow manages to lose the monarchy's bling in a giant muddy estuary while running for his life. It is the perfect summary of John as a ruler. Not glorious defeat, not noble sacrifice, just a logistical catastrophe in wet dirt. England really looked at this man and got bad king, worse luck, worst route planning. 32. The Wanli Emperor of Ming China did something so passive-aggressive it loops back around into political performance art. Angry over succession disputes and frustrated with officials, he gradually stopped showing up. Morning audiences, ceremonies, direct engagement, decisions that needed imperial presence, all of it started disappearing into a long imperial sulk. Britannica calls him a recluse, and later accounts hammer the point harder. For decades, he increasingly withdrew from active governing rituals while the bureaucracy clogged and factionalism deepened. Imagine the civil service equivalent of trying to run a multinational corporation while the chief executive has ghosted everyone for years, but still technically refuses to resign. That was the vibe. The Ming state kept moving because the machine was huge, but the absence at the top mattered. He did not always do literally nothing, yet the political symbolism was devastating. The Emperor of China basically went on a royal strike and expected the universe to deal with it. 33. Abdallah Bucaram of Ecuador entered office like a populist firecracker and left it 6 months later because Congress declared him mentally unfit to govern, which is a sentence you never want on your political resume. Nicknamed El Loco, he treated the presidency like a permanent variety show. He sang songs from his own album in public, loved outrageous stunts, and used television the way a chaos goblin uses an unlocked microphone. Contemporary coverage described a president who sang, performed, and turned politics into spectacle while the country slid into crisis. That is the key detail. It was not just flamboyance, it was flamboyance during actual governance failure. Ecuador did not need a head of state moonlighting as an entertainer with Batman-level costume energy. It needed adulthood. Instead, it got a man who seemed to think being president was mostly about staying on camera long enough for reality to get tired and go home. Reality did not. So now settle it properly in the comments. Who was the most dangerously stupid ruler here, and who absolutely deserved a spot on this list but we did not mention? Name them and defend your pick like your reputation depends on it. And if this video made you laugh, rage, or lose faith in humanity just a little, hit like, subscribe, and come back for more history at its dumbest.